The last 2 weeks, the hospital has been very busy. There's a lot of people being affected by a lot of different types of sicknesses. Several of my friends have actually gotten the flu this year already, and they have been sharing with me how this flu is horrible, and the vaccines aren't really helping, and they're just expressing how hard and difficult this flu was this year. I even had one friend that's saying having the flu this time reminded her of when she had COVID. And that just had me thinking about what it was like during COVID. During the height of COVID, I was serving at my last church in Ohio. I was also starting my work as a chaplain in the hospital. And when COVID hit Ohio, our governor was very quick to shut everything down. Our churches shut the doors for several weeks, and we scrambled to provide impactful connections. We ended up doing online services, and we tried to start these new small groups. And there was so many different opinions, and a lot of people in the church were emailing and calling the pastoral staff, and they all had different solutions for what we should do. There was a lot of unknown, there was a lot of fear, and to be honest, I have to tell you, it was a bit uncomfortable, and it was very disorienting for a lot of people. But as a church board and as the leadership team of the church, we did what we could to protect our community and also to keep our connections to God and to each other. Connection is very important, and I just think of that COVID time. It told us how well or not well our communities did when handling the challenges of staying connected in a new way. Last week, Pastor Norma, she challenged us to look to Jesus. So this week, we are going to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. We are going to look at a story that happened near the start of Jesus' ministry on earth. And we are going to see what we can learn from Jesus' point of view in that story. In the Gospels, there are lots of passages where Jesus does ministry on one side of the Sea of Galilee. He gets in a boat and he travels to the other side of Sea of Galilee, and he does ministry over there. A lot of our Bible stories pinpoint back and forth across the sea. And this story today is one of those times where Jesus was just returning from the sea. And on this particular day, there was a crowd waiting for him. And in that crowd, there was a desperate father named Jairus. And he comes bursting forth to the front of the crowd. Now, you have to know something about this man. He is a leader in the synagogue. He is a man who normally probably really kept his cool. But now, in this moment, he is a man in a panic. His need to maintain control and to maintain his social status went out the window. It didn't matter that with one misstep, he could find himself toppling to the bottom of his society. His 12-year-old girl was sick. In fact, she was dying. And he was willing to do anything. He didn't care about what people thought. And he had heard all these people in this crowd talking. And he had heard them talking about a prophet that had just returned to town. And he could be seen running through the streets, desperately searching for this rumored prophet. And Jairus, that father, he found Jesus. And this important man in society was desperately leading Jesus through those pressing crowds. He was doing what he could to get this teacher to his house and to his precious 12-year-old girl. They were on a mission, and they were like cutting through the crowds like an ambulance cuts through our traffic today. When out of nowhere, Jesus just stops. This is a very stressful moment in scriptures. And it kind of leaves us hanging here for a minute. And this passage leaves room for waiting. It leaves room for anticipation, and it leaves room for nerves to set in. You see, our story today had another character, a woman in the crowd who had been internally bleeding for 12 years. Since the day Jairus' little girl had been born, this woman had been bleeding. We can safely say that she has long since exhausted all the cures from quacks and doctors to no avail. She was publicly known as unclean, and to touch her would be a violation of the holiness code. She was at the very bottom of the social totem pole of society. And Jesus did the unthinkable. She reached out and she touched Jesus. And Jesus stopped. During the height of COVID, I was a chaplain. I was starting my chaplaincy training. It was somewhat new to me. But my job for months was to go from room to room, wheeling a computer to provide Zoom calls. And sadly, for the most part, those conversations were one-sided. It was the opportunity that the family had to say goodbye to their dying loved ones. And one day I was walking down the hall and I heard this woman yelling in the room, which is really rare because if you have COVID that is severe enough to be in the hospital, normally you are very short of breath and you don't hear yelling. Most of the time people are on ventilators within 24 hours when they got to the hospital. But I went over to the small window and I picked up the phone that acted like the intercom system into the room. And I started to talk to her. And she is crying, and she starts talking, and she is just expressing her despair. She is realizing that she's alone and no one's there. So from talking to her, I realized she had more of an emotional distress than a physical need in that moment. So I thought, you know what, I am the right person to go in to be with her. She doesn't need a nurse right now. So I know many of you have seen all the photos of the healthcare workers during COVID, and maybe many of you have worn that get-up to go into somewhere. But on that day, I was wearing scrubs. Chaplains don't normally wear scrubs, but at the time, the hospital didn't want us taking any germs home, so all staff were provided with scrubs at the hospital laundry. So I had my scrubs on, and I had booties over my feet. I had a gown on, I had a mask on, I had 2 pairs of gloves on, and I had this big, like, space-looking machine helmet on that had a fan in the back. It was really ridiculous. But back at the very beginning, people were very scared, and we had to do all those things. I had to put all of that on just to walk in that room and to hold that woman's hand who was crying. And as she was crying, she was a Christian, and she had told me that, you know what, this is really something out of the Bible. I feel like I'm a leper. I feel like nobody can touch me, nobody can look at me. I'm alone and I'm isolated and I'm scared. And she had only been in isolation for a few days. The author of our gospel today is Luke. And Luke is giving us a 12-year-old disease and a 12-year-old child. Jesus is on his way to help the high-status, clean family when the unclean, low-status woman defiles him by touching him. This woman is interrupting the narrative of this story. But as we read this morning, I don't think she was wanting to get caught. She didn't mean to interrupt. She did not intend to be caught. She did not intend on making a scene or stopping Jesus from getting to the important man's house. In verse 44, it says that she came up behind him and she touched just the edge of his cloak. She didn't even expect Jesus to notice. And I could just see her shuffling her way through that fast-moving crowd. getting just close enough just to lay a hand on Jesus without being noticed. And then in her mind, she probably thought she would drop back into the crowd and make her way quietly home. Hopefully, her bleeding would stop and she could show herself to the priest of the time and turn over a new leaf of acceptance in society. If only she could sneak a miracle out of the healer, her life would be vastly different. And it almost worked. She followed her game plan perfectly. She got close enough. She reached out and she touched Jesus, and then she started to drop back. But the unexpected thing happened. The whole crowd came to a grinding halt. And Jesus just stopped in the middle of the road. And she was stuck in that crowd. She had nowhere to go. The crowd was confused. There was an emergency at the home of the synagogue leader, and Jesus just stopped. And then he asked, "Who touched me?" Which I quite think is a ridiculous question. The crowds that day were like the crowds on a New York City subway or at a football stadium when rival teams are playing, or even on an airplane aisle as people are trying to get off to make their connecting flight. In verse 46, Jesus says, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." And that sea of people began to part, and she was exposed in the middle of the crowd. And in an instant, everyone saw her, an unclean woman in their midst. Before they could freak out, before the fear about being touched by her were verbalized, before they were able to condemn her for breaking the rules and entering the crowd as an unclean woman, the woman fell to her knees in front of Jesus, and she told her story. With each sentence, the healing of a 12-year disease and the hardships that came with it were washing away. And with each sentence, a 12-year-old girl was also slipping away. The crowd probably thought, "This is crazy. He needs to hurry up. Why is he wasting his time? The woman has been unclean for 12 years. What is a few more hours? What is a few more days? Does it really matter? She's been this way for so long." There was a precious daughter of an esteemed leader who was fading away in these very moments. I served as a church planter pastor in Croatia for 6 years. And one summer, my ministry partners were in the States, and I was left to help our local people keep the church going for the summer. And in August in Croatia, a lot of Croatians go to the coast for the whole month. So we were pretty sparse, so I was doing a lot for the church in that August. And one of my Croatian leaders, Roby, he called me really late one Saturday evening. So late that I was already in bed, sound asleep. His family was out of town on the coast like many other Croatian families, so I knew it was important. Half asleep, I kind of listened to the story, and Roby was telling me the story about how his brother had been at a wedding that evening. And a woman who turned out was a wedding crasher approached him, and she actually propositioned him. And he sat and he talked to this woman, and he found out that her name was Kiki. And Kiki often shows up at weddings and different things because A, she knows she can get a good meal, but also B, she would try to find a client for the night at different events in town. Roby's brother explained that he was a Christian. And instead of taking her up on his offer, he invited Kiki to come to church. And I remember thinking, that's great, that's amazing. Roby's brother is out sharing Christ, and he's not afraid to share Christ with anybody. But I was confused. Why was he telling me this in the middle of the night? I had met Roby's brother briefly at one of the children's birthday parties, and I know for a fact that he is a leader of a different church in town. So my half-awake self was not really connecting the dots, not understanding why Roby is calling me in the middle of the night to tell me this story, until Roby said, "This type of woman is not allowed to step foot in his brother's church." And Roby was wanting to know if his brother had permission to bring this woman to our church. So in the crowds that day, as Jesus looked down at that trembling woman who is not allowed to participate in society, a woman who just confessed all in front of a crowd that is ready to condemn her, Jesus replied, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Did that condemning crowd hear him right? Jesus just called this unclean woman daughter, as in precious daughter, as in someone who is a member of the family, an insider, and someone who is closely related. Jesus continued to shock the crowd by commanding her to go in peace, which is a phrase at the time used for communal wholeness and belonging. She was no longer fractured from the worshiping community. She was free to enter the world. Jesus is doing more than physically healing this woman. He is saving her in every way possible a person can be saved. And during this life-altering, amazing, life-giving moment, a messenger arrives from Jairus' home, pronouncing, "Too late. She's gone. Trouble the teacher no more." Even though Jesus just turned this crowd upside down, Jesus is not done yet. He declares that the little girl is not dead, she's just sleeping. Only 6 people out of that huge crowd, only 6 people went into the house. Jesus reached out and took the hand of the little girl who was no longer breathing and commanded her to get up. Those in that house were astonished because she rose. Jesus told them to feed her and to all keep quiet about what just happened. I have encountered this passage before COVID, and I've encountered this passage after COVID. It wasn't until after COVID that I really studied and got down deep into this passage. And I wonder how my perspective would have changed if I studied it deep before COVID. But even if we use the analogy of COVID, it is still a lightweight analogy for what this Bible passage is. It's almost not fair to use it. COVID did affect our society, and our society has changed many ways because of it. But even after COVID, when you were recovered, you were welcomed with open arms. So today, we have to realize that Jesus is doing so much more than crossing lines and healing sickness. Jesus is crossing social and cultural lines that he is still crossing today. In Jesus' time, they did not have modern medicine or cleaning chemicals, no Lysol or Clorox. They did have rules, and the rules helped govern their lives. They had policies and sometimes politics in place that helped to preserve life. And there were 2 big rules. The top rule was you never, ever, for any reason, ever touch a dead body. And the second rule had to do with bleeding and blood. No person would have missed that Jesus blatantly ignored those rules, those practical wisdoms of the time. If there was a line drawn on the sand, Jesus did not just accidentally cross his toes over the line. He intentionally, purposefully walked right across that line. For the woman with the internal bleeding, anything she touched would have immediately become unclean. But the moment she touched Jesus, it was clear that something different was happening here. Her uncleanness was not able to infect Jesus. Something in him affected her. Her faith in Jesus made the difference. Our church in Zagreb, Croatia, held services on Sunday evenings. And I remember this Sunday in particular was very hot. Very, very hot. It was record-breaking hot. And fun fact, Croatians do not believe in AC. And they have this very, very weird superstition when it comes to cross breezes. So you never saw fans much either. I remember putting on a cotton t-shirt dress. It was very simple. It was like a t-shirt length sleeves. It had a V-neck, and it only went down to like mid-thigh. And I was at church, and I was setting up our hospitality table because Croatians can drink hot tea or coffee no matter the temperature outside. When my phone rang, Roby's brother wanted me to come outside. Roby's brother had Kiki with him, and he was very worried. He wanted me to come and meet her first before they came in. He was whispering in the phone that he was concerned about how Kiki was dressed, and he wanted me to really make sure that it was okay for her to come in. And I looked down at myself in my cotton t-shirt dress, exposing my knees, and I thought, this is ridiculous. Not wanting to get on an argument over the phone with a man I barely knew, I hurried outside. Kiki was clearly nervous. She had applied a lot of makeup, but when I looked at her, I saw a woman who wanted to come to church, and she was clearly trying to be respectful. She did not want to make a scene. You see, Kiki had on a long sundress that went all the way down to her ankles, and she had on this huge winter scarf covering up her cleavage area. I reached out my hands and I welcomed her with open arms, but my heart broke for this woman who was so nervous. She had to knock back a few to settle some nerves before coming to church. Kiki had been hurt by the church before. She knew that this time wasn't even normal, with all the clandestine phone calls and having to wait outside the church to get approval before she could even walk across the threshold. Kiki was looking for help. Maybe it took everything inside of her to walk to our church. Maybe she was looking to sneak a miracle for her life. And the crowds were condemning her. Kiki braved coming to church a few times, but it was very, very hard for her. She was more able to meet with me, and we'd go for walks. I had the privilege of walking along life with Kiki for a while. We prayed a lot, and I know that God is still reaching out to Kiki because she is his precious daughter. One of my mentors would ask me, or would ask any of us, who do we identify with in this story? Maybe you connected with the bleeding woman in this story. Maybe you connected with the dead girl. Maybe you connected with Kiki. If you feel like you need a miracle, today, Jesus is reaching out to you. He is coming for you today, not worrying about society rules. If you feel dirty, if you feel dead inside, if you feel isolated, God loves you and God is pursuing you. He wants to call you his precious child. No barriers should be put up on extending the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I want to be honest with you this morning. God checks me when I read this passage. Because sometimes, most of the times, I can identify with the disciples and the crowd in this story. I want you to think of the people in your life that you think would least likely experience the grace and the mercy of God. Maybe it's their day to sneak in a miracle. We all have a role to play, and God is calling us to cross those lines in our world, to reach out to those around us. And I'm talking about embracing that gut uncomfortableness of doing something that's so against the grain of our modern culture and our modern community. I am talking about being in that crowd and not questioning what Jesus is doing. I think as a community, we are doing amazing things, and we have some of the most amazing, beautiful hearts I've ever seen. And Pastor Norma last week reminded us to look to Jesus. Jesus is already here in Sarasota. He's already on these streets, and he's already loving people. As Nazarenes, we believe in something called prevenient grace. It is what we talked about today. It is that grace of God that pursues the lost even before they know his name. God is crossing boundaries and reaching you for where you are. And may you know this week that God loves every single person that you're encountering. So today, we are going to close out our service by participating in communion together. And we're going to have some people come forward and pass out the elements, and Amy's going to sing for us.